Everything has clearly gotten out of hand now, yes. But it was worth the risk, I assure you.
Thank you for joining us on the test bench. In our last two videos, we built a computer with a Pentium G4560, 8 GB of RAM, and a GTX 1050 we named Broadsword. Then we installed Windows 10 and basic software on it. Now we see how Broadsword handles. We'll start with the synthetic benchmarks because they're the least exciting. Broadsword got a Cinebench score of 375 and completed the render test in 1 minute and 42 seconds. In Firestrike, Broadsword gets a combined score of 5,695. In Mutagen Heaven, running at medium quality with medium tessellation at 1920 by 1080, we have a low frame rate of 8 frames a second, a high of 144 frames a second, and an average of 70 frames a second. What do these synthetic benchmarks tell us? They tell us something the rest of this video is going to confirm. Broadsword is not a machine for creating content like editing video or creating 3D objects, although it can do it. It's not a powerhouse, but for something in the $400 to $500 price range, it can consume content and consume it voraciously. All the gameplay benchmarks we're about to go over are indicative of the games running at 1920 by 1080 resolution. I'm also only going to be showing benchmarks for detail settings that go above 30 FPS, to give you a good idea of what a computer like Broadsword can do at playable frame rates. Ashes of the Singularity Escalation is an interesting benchmark. As a game, it's frenetic and confusing, but as a tech demo, it's phenomenal. It's one of the few games out there that will scale per core with a processor, so it lets you get a good idea of what a processor is capable of. The Pentium G4560's main claim to fame is, even though it's a dual-core processor, it has hyper-threading. So it has 4 threads, making it superior to more expensive dual-core i3 processors. On low settings, the combined benchmark score is 39 FPS low, 53 FPS high, and 49 FPS average. So, playable if you're one of the 5 people that actually plays Ashes of the Singularity and just doesn't use it to test computers. Deus Ex Mankind Divided is probably the most poorly optimized in this roundup, when comparing how it runs to how it looks. On the low preset, our low is 37 FPS, our high is 60 FPS, and our average is 48 FPS. On the medium preset, our low is 32 FPS, high is 49 FPS, and the average is 39 FPS. So you only get a modest performance drop for bumping up the detail. You can tell that Doom is made by people who really care. It's kind of touching considering the subject matter is eviscerating demons who think you're the most terrifying force in hell. On a personal note, I've been playing Doom since 1993, and the 2016 Doom is everything that an updated version of that should be. No reloading, maneuvering around incomprehensible monsters, multiple paths through levels, powerful weapons to mow down hordes of demons. Rip and tear. Doom is very sensitive to frame rates. The higher the frame rate, the more fluidly you move, and the more efficiently you dispatch the forces of hell. Using the Vulkan renderer option, our medium preset gets us a 58 FPS low, 87 FPS high, 73 FPS average. The high preset gets us 48 FPS low, 77 FPS high, and 63 FPS average. Our ultra preset looks fantastic, but our low dips below the 30 FPS mark and winds up at 28. Our high is 62, and our average is 44. When playing at Ultra, I noticed myself getting worse at playing the game because it wasn't as responsive as the lower detail settings. To play Doom on a computer with Broadsword's performance, I recommend the high preset so it looks great and kills great. Destiny 2. It's popular, so I'm benchmarking it. But I don't recommend it. Not because it's a bad game, it's actually incredibly fun. but because of Bungie's abusive business practices now that they're owned by Activision. It's not uncommon that once a Destiny 2 DLC launches, that the game locks you out of base features of the game you already paid for, until there's a public outcry and Bungie fixes it and claims it was an accident. One time, that's a mistake. Twice, I'll still give them the benefit of the doubt. 3 times, and every time after that, that's a pattern. We have one benchmark for the medium preset, but it tells us what we need to know. Our low is 59 frames per second, high is 113 FPS, and our average is 84 FPS. I noticed the frame rate tilted heavily to the low end while in the rain, and zoomed into the high end in corridors. The mini review is it's Halo with less substance and more whimsy. Some people are hardcore into Star Wars, some are Trekkies. I am a huge goddamn Fallout nerd, and I've been playing it since the first one came out in 1997. When the benchmark chart comes up here, you're going to notice it's a little different. The high end stops at 60 frames a second. That's because with the engine Bethesda's been using since Morrowind, they called it the Creation Engine starting with Skyrim, but it's the same thing under the hood. You want to keep yourself below 90 frames a second, where the physics engine decouples from the rest of the game and objects go wonky. Like accidentally bumping a barrel will kill you from impact damage kind of wonky. So clamp it at 60 frames a second, and you're good to go. And the good news is, this definitely clamps at 60 frames a second. This benchmark is divided into 2 parts of the world instead of different settings. On medium settings, while out in the wilderness, we hold a solid 60 frames a second. We had a brief dip down to 55 frames a second for no reason that I could discern that didn't throw off the overall average of just holding 60. In Boston, the frame rate lowers weirdly. We have a low of 40, an average of 50, and a high of 60. It bounced between 43 and 52 a lot while I was playing. I think the benchmarks are especially helpful because Fallout 76 is coming out later this year, using the same engine though with a slightly upgraded renderer. So this should give you some idea of how a computer like Broadsword will run the upcoming game. What I love about these results is when Fallout 4 initially came out, I was playing it on an i3-2120 with a GTX 750 Ti at medium settings at 2560 by 1080 resolution at a rock solid 28 frames per second. As for my mini review of Fallout 4, it is the second worst Fallout game out there, with the worst being Brotherhood of Steel, which was an Xbox and PlayStation 2 exclusive around the turn of the century. That being said, Fallout 4 is an incredibly fun game, and I go so far as to say that Fallout 4 is the best Far Cry game ever made. And speaking of Far Cry, here we have Far Cry 5, the newest game in our roundup. I plan on doing a long review of this one because I've recently completed it, but I'd declare it the best Far Cry game ever made after Fallout 4. Our benchmark results get kinda weird with it. The low preset has a low of 39 FPS, a high of 55, and an average of 45. Our medium preset has a low of 34, a high of 50, and an average of 40. We only lose 5 frames, a pretty linear fall off for vastly improved visuals. Our last test was out of curiosity. Again, we have the medium preset, but with anti-aliasing turned off. You'll notice our low is lower than the other 2 tests, but our high is now 60 frames a second, and our average is 51. So medium, with no anti-aliasing, performs better than low settings with anti-aliasing. So if you do get this game, which I highly recommend you do, definitely play around with the settings to see what you get. A lot of people are shocked when I tell them I've never played a Final Fantasy game, so Final Fantasy 15 is my first. It's not a bad game. I don't dislike it, but I don't think it's my thing, so I don't feel like I can offer an informed opinion. That being said, it runs like a champ. On the low preset, we have a low of 48 FPS, a high of 65, and an average of 57. Cranking it to the medium preset vastly improves the visuals with no real degradation in performance, getting us in 48 FPS low again, a 60 FPS high, and a 54 FPS average. I originally wasn't going to benchmark Fortnight, but it comes at the low price of free, and 3 million players can't be wrong. Just, if you play this one, turn on two-factor authentication. My Fortnite account was hacked. Luckily, it wasn't attached to PayPal or a credit card. But Epic doesn't have any kind of measure to limit password tries, so people sit on password cyclers, and just give enough time, they'll crack your password. Feel free to Google all of that if you want to see all the horror stories. Fortnite has the biggest frame rate jumps between quality presets out of all of the games we're benchmarking today. The medium preset gets us a 79 FPS low, a 93 FPS high, and an 85 FPS average. The high preset dips mightily to a 54 FPS low, 63 FPS high, and 55 FPS average. The Epic preset has incredibly uneven and unepic performance at a 26 FPS low, 50 FPS high, and a 40 FPS average. It's
Grand Theft Auto
5. This is another series I've been playing since the first one came out in the 90s, back when it was a top-down 2D something. Don't know what genre you would use to classify Grand Theft Auto and Grand Theft Auto 2. This is an incredibly fun game I recommend getting if you haven't for some reason already. Rockstar has also declared the PC version to be the definitive version of the game, so this is the best version of it to get. I did the testing with the medium preset and high texture detail. Our low was 40 FPS, our high was an absurd 161 FPS, and our average was 130 FPS. Now, this is running GTA 5's built-in benchmark, so when you're on the ground and the cops are chasing you and explosions are happening, I'd expect the average FPS to be somewhere in the 60 to 75 range. And lastly, we have Overwatch. Before I started running these benchmarks, I assumed Fortnite with its super cartoony graphics and low poly models would have been the best performer, but we're looking at it right here. I didn't even bother with the low or medium presets for this one. The high preset gets a 103 FPS low, a 124 FPS high, and a 114 average FPS. Cranking this up to the Ultra preset, we get 87 FPS low, 113 FPS high, 94 FPS average. If literally all you play is Overwatch, you don't need a better computer than this. So, final verdict on building a machine like this? I'm impressed. If something this powerful had fallen into my lap around 2015, I would have been insanely grateful and possibly never looked back. The G4560 and GTX 1050 paired together are solid performers for gaming and have more than enough horsepower for general use. I think a lot of hardware enthusiasts and a lot of tech channels get hung up on always getting the fastest, most expensive components, striving to build the Ferrari of computers. But there's nothing wrong with a Hyundai accent, and that's the kind of computer Broadsword is. It'll get you where you're going and has enough features to make you comfortable. I'd love to hear what you all think in the comments. Is a budget computer like Broadsword something you could live with? Or do you think it's better to go for the top end, regardless of cost? Like this video and subscribe to the Test Bench. Feel free to join us on Facebook. Back us on Patreon if you want to help us show you more cool stuff. And follow us on Twitter. You'll find clickable links in the description. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to check out our other videos.